Have you ever wondered what truly fuels those extraordinary acts of goodness? What drives someone to commit truly heroic moral acts? Or maybe dedicate their entire lives to a cause, often, in the face of incredible opposition?
Hmm.
Think about the almost unimaginable selflessness, that unwavering dedication of those unsung heroes during World War II. People who risked absolutely everything, their lives, their family's safety, just to hide Jewish people from Nazi occupation.
It's astounding, really.
Or, global figures like Mahatma Gandhi championing nonviolent resistance. Or Mother Teresa, renowned for her persistent, far-reaching dedication to serving the poorest of the poor, even when facing profound personal and systemic adversity.
Yeah.
It really makes you pause, doesn't it? What is it about these individuals that makes them consistently choose that path of integrity and compassion, often at immense personal cost when, let's face it, others might falter?
It's truly one of those big, head-scratching questions that stumped philosophers and psychologists for centuries. For decades, a lot of our focus in understanding morality was, quite rightly, on what people think is right or wrong, their moral reasoning,
Well,
essentially.
How they judge things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We studied how people decide if something is fair or just. But the real conundrum, and where things get truly fascinating, maybe even a bit complex, is that leap from simply knowing what's right to doing it.
Ah, the action part.
And crucially, doing it consistently, sometimes over a whole lifetime, even when it's incredibly difficult or dangerous. We see this gap all the time,
Uh-huh.
between judgment and action. And it just begs for a deeper, more profound explanation beyond just, cognitive reasoning.
That's exactly where the concept we're diving into today comes in. We're taking a deep dive into moral identity. It's a concept that sits right at the crossroads of moral development and identity formation, and it provides this crucial bridge, really, between moral judgment and moral action. It helps us understand why some people consistently do the right thing, not just know the right thing.
Yes.
At its heart, moral identity is about how absolutely essential morality is to a person's very sense of self. Think of it as, I don't know, the ultimate internal compass, or maybe even a fundamental operating system guiding their decisions and behavior.
Exactly. And that centrality, that profound integration, is precisely what helps bridge that often observed gap. It transforms morality from just an abstract concept, set of external rules or philosophical idea, into an intrinsic, almost non-negotiable part of who a person is.
Right.
When morality is woven into the very fabric of your being, it guides your choices and commitments with this powerful internal force that's frankly far more resilient than mere obligation or following rules.
Now, if you're like our listener today, perhaps an elementary education major, maybe newly interested in identity and psychology, this deep dive is absolutely for you.
Definitely.
As a future educator, you're going to be uniquely positioned to nurture the developing moral compasses of young people. Understanding moral identity can really illuminate how children and adolescents develop their values and, critically, how you might intentionally design learning environments, interactions to nurture that development right there in your classroom.
Yes. It's so practical.
It's not just about teaching them rules to follow, but helping them internalize goodness, shaping who they become.
Precisely. It offers a really powerful, almost transformative framework for thinking about character education that goes far beyond simple obedience or, getting stickers. It's about building a robust internal framework for ethical action.
Okay, so our mission today is clear. First, we'll explore the surprisingly diverse ways scholars conceptualize moral identity, how they define this moral self, and why those distinctions actually matter. Then, we'll examine the compelling and sometimes surprising evidence linking moral identity to real-world, consistent moral action.
Yeah, the proof in the pudding, so to speak.
Exactly. After that, we'll dive into how this profound moral identity develops, tracing its origins from crucial childhood foundations right through the complexities of adolescence.
Which is key for educators.
Absolutely. And finally, we'll address some of the healthy skepticism surrounding the concept, acknowledging its limitations, and highlight some exciting directions for future research that promise to deepen our understanding even further.
Sounds like a great plan.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're talking about morality being a core, central, and highly salient part of your personal identity, not just like a set of rules you follow. But how do different experts define this moral self or explore its intricate workings? It turns out there isn't one single, universally agreed upon definition.
No, not at all. What's truly fascinating here is that diversity. Think of it like looking at a magnificent ancient tree. One person might focus on the type of wood, its enduring qualities, its strength, its grain, its deeply rooted nature.
Okay, the stable part.
Right. While another looks at how it responds to sunlight and rain over time, how its leaves unfurled, how it grows and adapts to the seasons.
More dynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Broadly speaking, these are the character perspectives versus the social cognitive perspectives. It's a distinction quite similar to what we see in personality psychology, actually. The trait approach versus the social cognitive approach.
So on one hand, we have these character perspectives, which generally see morality as a more stable, enduring, almost trait-like core part of who you are. It's about a consistent, deeply ingrained individual difference that tends to show up across different situations and over time.
Exactly. And a truly seminal starting point for this view comes from Augusto Blasi's self model. Blasi, in his, groundbreaking work, really highlighted that persistent, nagging gap we mentioned earlier.
Right, the judgment-action gap?
The one between moral judgment, knowing what's right, and moral action actually doing it. He argued quite convincingly that moral identity, as a specific configuration of the self, helps bridge this disconnect. It's not just about having the knowledge, it's about having a self that sort of demands you act on that knowledge.
Okay, and how does Blasi break that down? What are the components?
He suggests 3 key components that explain how moral identity motivates action. The first is a judgment of responsibility. It's not enough, Blasi argued, to simply judge an action as right in some abstract sense. You also have to perceive it as necessary or binding for you personally.
So it becomes personal, not just someone should help, but I must help.
Precisely. It transforms from an external, objective moral principle to a deeply internal, personal imperative. And the criteria for these personal judgments, for Blasi, often stem directly from the structure of the self.
Which leads to the second component.
Yes, his second crucial component, moral identity as self-structure. This reflects the individual differences in the extent to which being moral is central or absolutely essential to one's overall sense of self. It's about what makes up your identity. What specific moral values do you hold? Things like kindness, fairness, integrity.
The content.
Right, the content. And also how you experience that identity. Is it organized, unified, deeply integrated, or maybe more fragmented? The structure.
Okay.
For an elementary education major, thinking about your students, this is incredibly practical. Imagine a student in your classroom who, when seeing someone accidentally drop their books, papers scattering everywhere, they immediately help.
Yeah.
Without being asked.
Yeah.
It's not because you told them to or because they'll get a sticker or praise. They help because they genuinely see themselves as a helpful person. That act of kindness isn't just a rule they follow. It's a self-defining act, an expression of their core identity. Their moral identity is driving that behavior, making it feel natural and necessary.
And the third piece, the one that ties it all together.
That's self-consistency. This is that fundamental human desire, almost a psychological imperative, to act in a way that's consistent with your sense of self. So if your core identity is deeply centered on moral concerns, this desire for self-consistency becomes an incredibly powerful moral motivator.
So if you act against that core moral self,
It leads to uncomfortable, dissonant, often negative feelings, what you might call an internal ick or a pang of guilt or shame. It feels wrong, fundamentally.
like that child you mentioned, the fair leader, if
Yeah.
they accidentally show favoritism.
Exactly. Imagine that child who identifies as a fair leader during a group game. If they slip up, maybe give their friend an extra turn, they might feel a genuine internal discomfort. That strong psychological drive for self-consistency prompts them to correct their behavior, to ensure everyone gets a fair turn, or maybe apologize and make amends. It's that deeply ingrained internal compass nudging them back into alignment with their true moral north.
It's about living up to your own self-image.
Yes, a deep psychological drive to live up to one's truest self. For those with a strong moral identity, not acting morally would feel like a betrayal of their very being.
And Blasi also talked about the maturity of subjective identity, right? How identity shifts as we grow.
Yes, he suggested that as our identity matures, particularly through adolescence and into adulthood, it tends to shift. It moves from being primarily based on external characteristics like physical appearance, popularity, who our friends are, to being based more profoundly on internal values, principles, and long-term goals.
So the self becomes more internal.
More internal, more organized, more unified. And individuals feel a greater sense of agency and ownership over their identity and their actions. For Blasi, this maturation provides a key mechanism for moral identity to motivate consistent action. When individuals with a mature subjective identity truly internalize and appropriate moral identity contents, that heightened sense of agency, combined with a deep commitment to their core self, becomes an incredibly powerful and self-sustaining moral driver
An integrated self-choosing morality.
because it aligns with its deepest essence.
Yeah. This idea of deep integration takes us naturally to another fascinating perspective within these character approaches. Colby and Damon's idea of the unity of self and moral goals. They did those groundbreaking studies of moral exemplars.
Right, individuals widely recognized for lifelong, exemplary moral commitments, often in extraordinary circumstances. Think rescuers during the Holocaust, lifelong civil rights leaders.
And what did they find?
What they found was truly profound. These individuals didn't see their moral commitments as a sacrifice or some burdensome obligation. Instead, fulfilling those moral commitments was inextricably linked to fulfilling themselves. Their personal interests and their moral desires were seamlessly integrated.
Wow. So doing good was feeling good for them.
Essentially, yes. They experienced a profound, almost indistinguishable integration. It wasn't about making a difficult choice between what they wanted and what was right. What was right was what they wanted. It was central to their thriving, to their sense of purpose.
Can you give a classroom example of that?
Absolutely. Think of a student who consistently volunteers their recess time to help a struggling classmate with homework. They're not doing it for reward or praise from the teacher or to look good to their peers.
Okay.
They genuinely feel good, a sense of profound satisfaction when helping others learn. And it aligns perfectly with their self-perception as maybe a supportive peer or a community builder in the classroom.
Yeah.
For them, not helping wouldn't just be an oversight. It would feel fundamentally wrong, a denial of a core part of who they are. Their deepest interests are served by acting morally.
Some scholars even take this further and see moral identity as basically synonymous with an altruistic personality, like it's just a bundle of traits.
Sort of, yeah. This perspective views it as a constellation of stable, other-oriented traits like empathy, social responsibility, and a fundamental personal investment in helping others. This is where we identify that deep-seated care for others manifesting consistently, almost instinctively.
Like a child who just always seems to be kind.
Exactly. The child who always offers a comforting word or intuitively helps another pick up dropped crayons without any prompting or thought for a reward. It's less a conscious decision in the moment and more an underlying, enduring trait of genuine concern for others' well-being.
And then there's narrative moral identity. This one focuses on our life stories, right? Our self-narratives.
Precisely. This approach suggests that moral values and themes aren't just isolated ideas floating around. They're deeply woven throughout one's personal story, forming a coherent and meaningful account of who they are and why they act the way they do. Moral exemplars, for instance, have life stories that are incredibly rich with moral functioning. Their ethical choices are central to their identity narrative.
This sounds really interesting for our listener, the future educator.
It absolutely is. Imagine a young person's life story as a personal journal. They're constantly writing and revising. This approach suggests that if morality is truly central to their identity, their journal entries wouldn't just describe events. They'd be full of moral themes, descriptions of moral choices they've made, reflections on dilemmas, insights into right and wrong.
So as an educator, you could actually help shape that narrative.
Profoundly. Encouraging students to write narratives about personal challenges and how they resolve them, maybe a conflict with a friend or a time they had to make a tough ethical choice, and prompting them to reflect on the moral dimensions of their choices, helps them integrate moral themes directly into their personal story. This act of self-authorship strengthens their moral identity by literally weaving it into their developing sense of self. They become the moral protagonist in their own story.
Okay, so that covers the character perspective, seeing morality as relatively stable, enduring, deeply ingrained. But then we shift gears to the social cognitive perspective. These view moral identity as more dynamic, more fluid, rooted in mental processes that constantly interact with specific situations.
Right. It's less about a fixed trait and more about the active psychological mechanisms that underlie moral functioning in the moment. Here, personality itself is conceptualized as a dynamic system of cognitive affective processes interacting with the environment.
And a key idea here is moral identity as chronically accessible moral schemas. What are schemas exactly?
Schemas are essentially mental blueprints or highly organized knowledge structures. They represent things like what it means to be a moral person, how to act morally in different situations, what fairness looks like, how to show compassion, these kinds of things.
Mental shortcuts.
Sort of, yeah. And when these schemas are chronically accessible, it means they are easily, almost automatically, activated to interpret and respond to social situations.
And this accessibility allows for what they call automaticity and moral expertise, right? Like muscle memory for morals.
Exactly. Like a seasoned chess player who sees moves instinctively, or a musician who plays without conscious effort. For instance, a child who has well-developed and chronically accessible sharing schemas might automatically offer a toy to another child who looks sad or left out.
Without thinking, oh, I should share now.
Precisely. Without consciously having to deliberate or think through a list of right things to do, their internal moral script for sharing is readily available, allowing for a quick, almost intuitive moral response. This perspective suggests that moral exemplars might be experts in morality, not just because they have good intentions, but because they possess these rich, highly organized, and easily accessible networks of moral schemas.
So for an educator, this means
It means that repeated exposure, practice, and discussion of moral concepts and behaviors helps build these neural pathways, these mental blueprints. You're essentially building their internal moral library and making the important books easy to find. It makes moral action more likely and more effortless over time.
another social cognitive view is moral identity as a self-important social identity. Can you break that down?
Sure. We all have many social identities based on groups we belong to, like being a member of the school band, or roles we play like being a student or a friend, or even the kind of person we want others to see us as.
Right.
In this view, moral identity is seen as a specific type of person, social identity, organized around traits that define a moral person being fair, honest, compassionate, that sort of thing.
And the more central this moral identity is.
The bigger role it plays in guiding behavior.
Yeah.
However, a key idea in this social cognitive view is that situational factors can strongly activate or deactivate this moral identity.
So it's not always on.
Not necessarily at full strength. Think about a child who sees themselves primarily as a class helper that's more of a role-based social identity. A moral identity as a fair person is more of a person social identity, focused on abstract traits. The more important that fair person identity is to them, the more likely they are to act fairly.
Unless
Unless a strong situational factor like intense peer pressure to cheat or a compelling self-interest like winning a prize unfairly strongly pulls them another way. That situation might temporarily diminish the salience of their moral identity, making the other identity, like wanting to win, more prominent in that moment.
Okay, that makes sense. And building on that, some researchers see moral identity as commitment to moral social roles. So it's about specific roles.
Yeah, rather than just a general person identity, this view emphasizes how moral identity can be defined by the degree to which specific moral actions and socially recognized roles become central to the self. Things like being a dedicated volunteer at an animal shelter, a consistent blood donor, or an environmental activist.
So the action defines the identity.
In a way, yes. The idea is that actively adopting and committing to these pro-social roles and consistently acting in accordance with them strengthens one's moral identity. These roles provide a framework for moral action and a sense of belonging to a community of like-minded individuals, which further solidifies the moral self.
Then there's the intriguing idea of moral self-representations in autobiographical memory. How does memory fit in?
Well, our entire sense of self is built from this complex web of mental representations in memories of past actions, thoughts, feelings, often infused with rich emotion. This perspective suggests that moral identity involves these self-representations being tied to moral meaning. They form a coherent moral self-narrative that constantly informs our present.
So it's like our personal history book, but highlighted for moral moments.
Exactly. And the pages aren't just facts. They are vividly colored by moral experiences, successes, failures, and their emotional echoes. When you face a new moral situation, your brain can quickly flip back through those moral pages, recalling how you felt when you stood up for someone or the regret you felt when you didn't.
And that guides you.
It can guide you with powerful moral intuitions. Those gut feelings about what's right, based on deeply embedded past experiences and the emotions tied to them. For example, if a child remembers how genuinely good it felt to stand up for a bullied classmate, that memory, infused with positive emotion, might instantly spring to mind and powerfully guide their actions in a similar situation in the future. The moral choice becomes almost automatic.
How is that different from the narrative moral identity we discussed earlier?
It's subtle but distinct. Narrative moral identity focuses more on the overarching life story and its themes. This perspective emphasizes the specific, emotionally laid memories, the building blocks that constitute that narrative, and directly trigger intuitive responses.
Got it. And finally, within the social cognitive framework, there's moral ideal self. This is about who we want to be.
Precisely. Part of moral identity isn't just who you are now, but who you aspire to be. This refers to the degree to which one's desired future self, their ideal self or possible self, is deeply moral. This acts as a powerful goal, pulling you forward and motivating future behavior.
How could a teacher use that idea?
Oh, this is a fantastic and highly actionable concept. Imagine encouraging your students to draw or write, or even just discuss the kind of person I want to be when I grow up. If many include moral traits like kind, brave, someone who helps others, or someone who makes the world better.
You're helping them visualize their moral future.
Exactly. You're visualizing and solidifying their moral ideal self. As an educator, you can help them connect their daily actions, small acts of kindness, fair play in games, speaking up against unfairness to this grander future vision. This makes moral behavior not just about avoiding punishment, but about actively pursuing and becoming the person they most admire and aspire to be. It acts like a powerful, often subconscious magnet, pulling them towards good.
Okay, so those are the two main camps, character and social cognitive. But you mentioned there are also some alternative perspectives.
Yes, perspectives that offer different but equally valuable lenses. One is the classic identity status paradigm from Erickson and Marcia. This framework, broadly speaking, suggests identity formation involves two key processes: exploration, actively grappling with various issues and possibilities, and commitment, adopting certain principles or roles.
And how does moral identity fit into those statuses?
Well, you can think about it this way. A person who hasn't really thought about or made strong moral commitments, maybe just drifting, could be seen as being in diffusion.
No exploration, no commitment.
Right. Someone who just dogmatically accepts moral principles from, say, their parents or their religion without much personal reflection or questioning might be in foreclosure. They've committed, but without independent exploration.
Okay.
But then, as individuals actively seek to validate moral principles, engaging in critical reflection and maybe testing things out in the real world, they enter moratorium. This is a period of active questioning and searching.
Exploring but not yet committed.
Exactly. And finally, once they truly appropriate moral principles as their own, seeing them as self-defining because they've genuinely thought them through and wrestled with them, they reach achievement.
Can you make that concrete for a classroom? Say, middle school?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Consider a middle school ethics class debating a tricky moral dilemma. Some students might be in moratorium, actively exploring different viewpoints, maybe challenging what they've always been told, really trying to figure out their own stance.
The teacher's role there is crucial.
Absolutely. A teacher can profoundly facilitate this exploration by providing a safe, intellectually stimulating space for diverse viewpoints, encouraging critical thinking about the why behind different moral positions, posing challenging what-if questions. When a student eventually commits to certain principles like fairness and group work, or speaking up against bullying not just because it's a rule, but because they've genuinely thought it through, tested it, and truly believe it, that's a powerful move towards moral identity achievement. It's their own moral framework, built on their own foundation.
Related to that is the identity styles model by Brzezinski, right? Which focuses more on how people process information.
Exactly. It looks not just at what commitments you make, but how people process identity-relevant information. Brzezinski identified three general styles: informational, normative, and diffuse avoidant.
Okay, what do those look like in practice?
Well, a student with an informational style will deliberately grapple with moral principles. If you assign that debate on a tricky moral issue, this student will likely research various viewpoints thoroughly, weigh pros and cons, and genuinely try to form their own reasoned opinion. They actively seek out information.
And normative.
A normative student might automatically adopt moral principles consistent with the groups they care about, perhaps echoing the opinions of their popular friends or their family's traditional views, often without much independent thought or critical evaluation. They conform to the norms of their significant others.
And diffuse avoidant.
A diffuse avoidant student might procrastinate thinking about moral principles altogether. They might be driven more by immediate situations, avoid the assignment, try to change the subject, or just put off dealing with the complexity. Understanding these different processing styles can significantly help educators tailor how they present moral dilemmas.
How so?
You might provide structured opportunities for genuine exploration for informational types, maybe offer gentle guidance and encourage perspective taking for those who tend to be normative, and perhaps provide more direct scaffolding support and clear structure for those who are diffuse avoidant, helping them engage with the material.
And finally, there's the relational perspective. This one sounds quite different.
It is quite different, yes. It radically challenges the traditional view of identity as something purely internal and individual. Instead, it suggests identity isn't just influenced by relationships, it's actually constituted by them.
Constituted, meaning relationships make identity.
In large part, yes. So morality, from this perspective, is seen as inherently context-dependent, with relationships themselves serving as moral compasses. It profoundly challenges us to see ourselves not as isolated individuals who simply internalize abstract values, but as a nexus of relationships.
So my moral identity isn't just in me.
Not solely according to this view. It's shaped, expressed, and even created within your interactions with others and your community. A child's moral identity, for instance, would be deeply intertwined with their relationships with family, friends, their teacher, their classroom community. They value their connections and use those relationships as moral compasses, guiding choices based on how they impact those connections and what the relationships demand of them. It's a morality that breathes and lives in connection.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds like there are quite a few different yet overlapping ways to define moral identity, which leads us to the question of potential integrations and challenges between these views.
Definitely. The character views tend to see moral identity as relatively stable and enduring, trait-like. The social cognitive perspectives see it as more fluid, dynamic, highly situationally influenced. And the relational view takes it even further, suggesting moral identity isn't even contained purely within the individual, but is distributed across relationships.
Can these views be reconciled?
Attempts to bridge these differences are ongoing, and it's a really vibrant area of debate in the field. For example, social cognitive scholars might suggest that while the self-centrality of moral schemas, how important they are to you, might be relatively stable over time, their actual activation and influence on behavior is highly situational.
But fundamental differences remain.
Yes, there are still fundamental differences and underlying assumptions about the very nature of the self and morality that make full integration quite challenging. For instance, that relational perspective fundamentally disagrees that moral identity is primarily an internal, stable trait. It sees it as something constructed and constantly enacted within relationships. This just highlights the inherent complexity and the ongoing theoretical richness of the field. There's no single neat answer yet.
So we've explored what moral identity is and how different scholars conceptualize it. We've seen it's about much more than just knowing right from wrong. It's about morality becoming deeply woven into your core being. Now, the truly pressing question, why does it matter? What's the tangible power of moral identity in action?
Well, the source material and extensive research consistently suggest that moral identity is an incredibly powerful source of motivation, potentially one of the very best predictors we have of consistent moral commitment and actual moral behavior.
And the mechanisms behind that?
They're multifaceted, really drawing from the concepts we just discussed. They include that powerful drive for self-consistency we talked about with Blasi, the automaticity provided by those chronically accessible moral schemas, the pull of moral ideal selves, and the rich guidance of autobiographical memory, those emotionally charged moral memories.
And there's solid evidence for this link.
Oh, yes. Despite the inherent challenges in precisely measuring such a rich and internal construct, research consistently shows remarkably strong and positive links between moral identity and real-world moral action. This has been found across diverse methodologies, different populations, different cultures. This isn't just theory, it's backed by robust evidence.
Let's delve into some of that compelling evidence. First up are the moral exemplar studies. These sound fascinating.
They're incredibly insightful. These are in-depth investigations of highly moral individuals, often people who engaged in extraordinary acts, like those who risked their lives saving Jews during the Holocaust, or lifelong human rights activists. Researchers would conduct extensive interviews, gather detailed life narratives, sometimes observe their daily lives.
And what did these studies consistently find?
They consistently found an almost profound and complete integration of self and moral goals in these individuals. Morality wasn't just a part of their identity. It was absolutely central to it, often driving lifelong commitments and actions that defied immense personal risk.
It was just who they were.
Exactly. Adolescent exemplars, for example, describe themselves with far more moral terms and goals than their peers. They seamlessly integrated their ideal selves into their actual selves and showed a much greater overlap between their daily actions and their deeply held personal goals. These aren't just individuals who perform one-off good deeds. We're talking about people whose very sense of who they are, their very reason for being, is intertwined with their moral compass. They don't think about being moral in each moment. They simply are moral. It's their default setting.
Then we have narrative studies looking at life stories again.
Right. Researchers analyze individuals' life stories, looking for themes, plots, character development related to morality. They've found that a higher salience of moral identity, meaning a greater concern for others' needs and rights, appearing as a central theme in their personal narrative, consistently correlates with generative concern.
Generative concern.
Yeah, that's a powerful desire to make a positive difference in the world, to contribute to the well-being of future generations. And importantly, the centrality of moral themes in these narratives predicted both self-reported moral behavior and actual observed moral behavior.
So for our elementary education major, this narrative approach is powerful.
Absolutely. Having students engage in narrative activities like writing their own hero's journey, where they face and overcome moral dilemmas, or creating a personal mission statement that explicitly includes their core values, can help them integrate moral themes into their personal story. By literally writing themselves as moral actors, they strengthen their moral identity, making it a more conscious and active part of their developing self. It helps them author a moral life.
Now let's talk about correlational studies. These give us the broader statistical picture, right? Showing connections between moral identity and various behaviors.
Exactly. And one of the most widely used measures in this area is Aquino and Reed's 10-item scale. It asks participants to visualize a person who possesses certain moral traits, like caring, compassionate, fair, generous, and then rate statements like, it would make me feel good to be a person who has these characteristics, or being someone who has these characteristics is an important part of who I am.
And this scale identifies two key dimensions.
Yes, two key subscales. And understanding the distinction is absolutely crucial, especially for educators: symbolization and internalization.
Okay, what's the difference?
Symbolization is about the outward display of moral identity, how you present yourself as moral to the world. It might be about seeking social recognition for your good deeds, or maybe avoiding negative judgment. It's the public face.
Then internalization.
Internalization, on the other hand, is about the relative centrality of moral identity in your overall self-schema. It reflects how deeply morality is integrated into your private sense of self. It's autonomous, self-regulated, and driven by intrinsic motivation, not external approval. It's about being moral because it's truly important to you.
And the key finding here is?
The key finding, and this is profoundly important for educators, is that internalization is generally more strongly and consistently related to morally relevant behavior than symbolization.
That makes intuitive sense.
It does, right. And it raises a critical question for our listener. When we encourage children to do good deeds in the classroom, are we fostering a genuine inner commitment, internalization, or are we inadvertently just teaching them to look good to others, symbolization?
Right. Are we building character or just managing appearances?
Precisely. The research strongly suggests that genuine internalization is far more powerful for consistent, authentic moral action, especially when no one is watching or when there's a personal cost involved. For example, studies found internalization predicted actual donation behavior in adolescence, a felt moral obligation even towards outgroup members, people from different backgrounds or countries.
Wow.
A willingness to extend love and status to strangers, a greater willingness to donate money to relief efforts for distant outgroups. It even predicted less likelihood of rationalizing violence, like killing, in response to descriptions of perpetrators like the 9/11 terrorists.
And symbolization.
Symbolization, conversely, was sometimes linked to things like self-reported unethical behavior or even charitable giving, but in ways that suggested it was more about managing one's image, maybe impressing others, than genuine altruism. It's the difference between a child helping just to get a sticker versus helping because they genuinely feel good about making a positive difference, even if no one notices.
Other quantitative measures show similar links.
Yes, things like simply rating the importance of moral values, like honesty, helping others, versus non-moral values, like being ambitious, having fun, to your sense of self. Higher importance placed on moral values has consistently been linked to less antisocial behavior, greater community involvement, and more pro-social behaviors in studies with teens and young adults across various cultures.
What about pro-social personality measures?
These are often composite measures, combining several related traits like sympathy, perspective-taking, the ability to understand others' viewpoints, and social responsibility. These composite scores reliably predict a wide range of prosocial behaviors, including really committed, long-term volunteerism and helping acts that seem motivated purely by selflessness rather than any personal gain. It speaks to a deeper, enduring commitment to helping others as part of one's fundamental character.
And Stetson Carter's social identity approach, what did that find?
They found that a strong moral identity predicted not only the likelihood of individuals reporting moral responses to hypothetical situations, but also, crucially, experiencing greater negative emotions like guilt or shame when they imagine themselves not taking a moral action. This really underscores that self-consistency drive we talked about earlier. Acting immorally feels bad when being moral is core to who you are.
Okay, and then there's the distinction between explicit and implicit moral identity. That sounds interesting.
It's truly fascinating for understanding real-time moral action. Explicit moral identity is what you consciously believe and report about yourself, typically measured by self-reports like, "I am a moral person." This predicted more deliberative, consciously chosen moral actions, things you plan or decide to do, like organizing a food drive or making a considered donation.
And implicit.
Implicit moral identity taps into those automatic unconscious associations we have with being moral. It's measured using techniques that bypass conscious reflection, like reaction time tests. And this predicted spontaneous moral actions.
Like what?
Like when you see someone drop their wallet and you instantly react to return it without even thinking. Or that example from a study where people given an extra lottery ticket by mistake were more likely to spontaneously return it if they had high implicit moral identity, even though no one would ever know if you just kept it.
So it's not just what you consciously say about being moral, but those deep-seated, almost automatic responses, those gut feelings, like when you see a child spontaneously comfort a crying friend without a second thought.
Exactly. That's your implicit moral identity at work, a testament to how deeply ingrained these moral responses can become. It's morality on autopilot, in a good way.
This leads us compellingly into experimental studies, which try to get at cause and effect by manipulating things. What have they found?
Well, researchers have found that you can actually temporarily activate or prime moral identity. For example, by asking participants to write about themselves using moral traits, or maybe recall times they acted morally, and doing this can actually reduce the effectiveness of moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement. That's like making excuses for bad behavior.
Exactly. It's rationalizing immoral acts, finding ways to justify doing wrong without feeling bad about it, blaming the victim, minimizing the harm, diffusing responsibility. Studies have shown that priming moral identity made people significantly less likely to morally disengage in response to reading about graphic instances of prisoner abuse, for example.
So just reminding people of their moral identity makes them less likely to excuse wrongdoing.
It seems so. It makes them more accountable to their own internal standards, less likely to let themselves off the hook.
What about the interplay between situational influence and centrality of moral identity? That sounds relevant for classrooms.
Incredibly relevant. One study found that priming moral identity predicted intentions to act morally, but especially for those for whom moral identity was less central to begin with.
Why is that?
Well, if your moral identity is already very strong and central, those moral schemas are probably chronically accessible anyway. You're already likely operating from a moral mindset, so a momentary prime doesn't add much. But here's the crucial nuanced part. Situational factors, like strong self-interest motives, say, a chance to gain money by lying, can actually decrease the accessibility of the moral identity schema. It pushes morality to the background.
And that leads to
intentions to lie or cheat. And strikingly, this negative effect of self-interest was stronger for those with high moral identity centrality.
Wait, stronger for those with high moral identity? That seems counterintuitive.
It does initially,
Right.
But it suggests that even a strong moral identity, when faced with overwhelming situational pressures or competing desires like financial incentives or maybe intense peer pressure, can be temporarily overridden or suppressed. It's not an impenetrable shield. The temptation can temporarily win out, even for highly moral people.
That is a truly significant point for our listener, thinking about the complexities of a real classroom. Kids face constant peer pressure, the desire for popularity, perceived self-interest in games or assignments. How do we foster a moral identity that can withstand those powerful external pulls?
That really is the million-dollar question for educators, isn't it? The studies suggest that for students who already have a reasonably strong moral identity, consistent reinforcement, repeated opportunities to actually act on their values, and maybe explicit discussions about navigating conflicting motivations can help them build resilience. It helps them resist negative influences and stay true to their inner compass when tested.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In one compelling group decision task study, participants initially made cooperative decisions in a game, but then they received feedback suggesting others were acting purely self-interestedly, creating strong pressure for them to defect too, just to protect themselves or maximize their own gain.
Okay, a classic social dilemma.
Exactly. Initially, priming moral identity helped those with low moral identity cooperate more. But later, when the pressure to defect was even stronger, the priming helped those with high moral identity stay true to their initial cooperative commitments, despite the strong temptation to defect.
So for the high moral identity folks, the priming helped them resist temptation.
Yes, it highlights the power of a deeply internalized moral identity to provide resilience and guide choices, even against challenging self-serving circumstances, especially if that identity is activated and made salient. It's like strengthening their moral resolve in the face of temptation.
Okay, so we've established what moral identity is and why it's such a powerful predictor of moral action. This leads us to arguably the most important section for our listener. How does it develop? What does this all mean for nurturing young learners? It's not just about teaching rules.
No, it's about helping morality become deeply woven into who a person is, guiding their choices from the inside out. Moral identity formation is really seen as this profound merging of moral development and identity development. You could even argue it's the ultimate goal of both processes.
So starting with the character perspectives, how do they see development unfolding? Where does it begin?
They see the early foundations being laid right there in childhood. As children begin to comply with rules, respond to praise from parents and teachers, and understand basic expectations, they start to form an initial, maybe rudimentary, good boy-girl schema, a sense of, I am good when I follow the rules.
And does that early sense matter?
Oh, yes. Research shows that preschoolers who had this moral component, even a nascent one, to their self-sense, were consistently more likely to feel bad about wrongdoing, to spontaneously apologize after transgressing, and to show genuine concern about others' distress. It's the beginning of internalizing goodness.
And emotions play a role early on.
Absolutely. The affective bases, things like empathy, the capacity to feel guilt, even constructive shame, feeling bad about the action, not the whole self, emerge early in childhood and are rapidly integrated with these emerging moral ideals and a child's developing sense of self.
So in the classroom, how can a teacher support this early stage?
It's incredibly actionable. When a teacher praises a child specifically for being such a good helper after they put away toys without being asked, they're not just acknowledging an action, they're actively reinforcing that child's emerging sense of a good identity, making that identity salient and valued.
Naming the trait.
Exactly. Or when a teacher helps children articulate their feelings, for example, you look sad that you took your toy. That feeling is empathy. You understand how she might feel if someone took her toy. They're explicitly linking emotions to moral situations. This is absolutely fundamental to moral identity formation. You're building their emotional literacy around ethics.
As children transition into adolescence, there are big shifts, right?
Huge shifts that deepen moral identity. Their moral understanding moves from concrete rules, don't hit, toward more abstract, complex, interpersonal, and ideological thinking. How can we be fair to everyone? What kind of society do we want? Adolescents become far more sensitive to others' expectations and needs, and their morality becomes more principled, less about just avoiding punishment, and more about concepts like fairness, justice, and care.
And their identity system is maturing at the same time?
Simultaneously, yes. In early adolescence, the self is often understood more from a social personality perspective, things like being kind, thoughtful, popular, funny. But in late adolescence, the self tends to become much more ideologically defined.
Ideologically, meaning based on
Deeply held moral principles, religious beliefs, political views, even life philosophies. They start to actively construct an ideological theory of self, a coherent worldview that integrates their values and tells them who they are and what they stand for.
How can a teacher foster that ideological development?
By designing learning experiences that push that thinking. Debate topics in middle or high school that encourage students to explore complex social issues from multiple perspectives. Think environmental justice, ethical uses of AI, global inequality. This helps them define and articulate their own ideological moral stance, moving beyond simple rules to deeply held, personally chosen convictions. Engaging in class discussions about fairness in group projects, or exploring responsibilities towards the wider community through analyzing current events, also profoundly fosters this ideological self-definition.
There's also a growing sense of agency and personal responsibility in adolescence.
Yes, definitely. Younger children often feel less personal responsibility for doing what's right. They might defer to adults or see rules as external. But as they mature, adolescents develop a much stronger sense of ownership over their actions and their identity. They start caring much more deeply about self-consistency. They want their actions to reflect who they genuinely believe themselves to be.
And educators can leverage that.
Absolutely. This is a prime opportunity. Empowering older students with genuine classroom responsibilities, maybe leading a peer mediation group, organizing a school recycling program, or allowing them to design and lead community service initiatives can profoundly foster their sense of agency in making a moral impact. It shifts them from being primarily externally regulated by rules to being internally driven by a sense of ownership over their moral actions and their developing moral identity. They see they can make a difference, and that becomes part of who they are.
What are some of the key predictors or factors that lead to stronger moral identity formation?
Well, several things seem to play a role. Certain individual characteristics matter. Interestingly, academic achievement tends to be a positive predictor, maybe suggesting a general capacity for growth and integration. Conversely, internalizing problems, things like anxiety, depression, withdrawal, tend to be negative predictors.
What about personality traits?
The traits like agreeableness, having more advanced moral reasoning skills, possessing a strong sense of personal agency, feeling connected to others, these are consistently linked to a stronger moral identity. And interestingly, the ability to learn from adversity, to reflect on challenges and grow from them can also significantly strengthen one's moral compass.
And the environment. What developmental contexts are important?
Huge factors here. Religious involvement for many individuals can be a significant predictor, often providing a clear framework for values and a supportive community. And, crucially for our listener, effective parenting plays an absolutely massive informative role.
What aspects of parenting are key?
Parental involvement, appropriate demandingness, meaning having clear expectations and standards, overall family support, warmth, and especially inductive discipline.
Inductive discipline, what's that?
That means explaining the consequences of a child's actions, not just punishing them, helping them understand why something is right or wrong, how their actions affect others, prompting perspective-taking. How do you think that made Sarah feel? This approach profoundly fosters the internalization of moral values rather than just compliance based on fear.
And that connects directly to teaching.
Absolutely. It's a direct, powerful analogy for classroom management and instruction. Using inductive discipline in the classroom, explaining why a rule is important, we need to share the art supplies so everyone gets a chance to create and nobody feels left out or frustrated, rather than just stating sharing is the rule helps children internalize the value behind the rule. And creating a warm, supportive, predictable classroom environment similar to parental warmth creates that safe psychological space essential for genuine moral development.
What about relationships outside the family?
Broader social relationships, both positive and sometimes even negative ones with peers, mentors, role models, they all significantly shape moral commitments. Even challenges to one's worldviews, maybe encountering diverse perspectives that cause some discomfort, can sometimes strengthen deeply held values by prompting deeper reflection and commitment.
And you mentioned opportunities for action.
Yes, and perhaps most vitally, opportunities for moral action are paramount. Things like community service, regular pro-social actions in daily life, volunteering, actively acting on one's principles isn't just a result of moral identity, it's also a powerful cause of its strengthening.
Doing reinforces being.
Exactly. These actions help individuals value their moral commitments even more deeply and see themselves as genuinely capable of making a positive difference in the world. So think about implementing meaningful service learning projects in your classroom, collecting food for a local shelter, making cards for seniors in a nursing home, organizing a school-wide kindness campaign. Even simple regular classroom jobs like kindness monitor or peacekeeper can provide concrete, repetitive opportunities for students to practice moral behaviors and see their immediate, tangible impact. This powerfully reinforces their developing moral identity. Okay, now shifting to the social cognitive perspectives on moral identity formation. How do they view development? This approach really emphasizes that development is all about building rich networks of those chronically accessible moral schemas. We talked about earlier, the prototypes, the action scripts, the possible selves. Children generally start with fewer schemas, they're less elaborate and less easily accessible, making it harder for them to respond promptly and appropriately to complex moral situations.
It's like their moral library isn't fully stocked yet, or the books are hard to find on the shelves.
That's a great analogy. Imagine a child's brain like a library. The more books on how to be good, they acquire like detailed understanding of fairness, compassion, responsibility, specific scripts for helping or sharing, and the more easily they can find and reference them, the better and more automatically they can respond to moral situations. These books are essentially their moral prototypes and action scripts.
Let's talk about moral prototypes first.
Okay, these are our mental images or representations of what it means to be a moral person, a collection of traits and behaviors we associate with goodness, honest, kind, fair, etc. These prototypes are heavily influenced by cognitive maturity, but crucially also by social learning.
Like seeing parents or teachers act morally.
Exactly. Parents modeling moral behavior, teachers highlighting positive character traits in stories, or discussing real-life examples, peers acting pro-socially. These all shape a child's moral prototype. The importance or salience of these prototypes, which is heavily influenced by the family and school environment, leads to their greater accessibility and influence on behavior.
And then there are moral action scripts or event representations.
Right. These are highly organized schemas for specific moral behaviors that develop through repeated social experiences. For example, a sharing script might involve recognizing someone's need, figuring out what to offer, making the offer, waiting for a response, maybe feeling good about it afterwards, or a helping script for when someone falls down.
So practice builds these scripts.
Yes. Repeated practice makes these behaviors more automatic and links them directly to self-evaluative emotions like pride or satisfaction. Think about regular role-playing scenarios in the classroom where students actively practice helping, sharing, or resolving conflicts respectfully. Repeated practice literally builds those behavioral scripts in their minds, making future moral actions more automatic and less effortful. Discussing characters in books who make moral choices and reflecting deeply on how those choices made the characters and others feel can also build these sophisticated moral schemas.
And lastly, for adolescents, possible selves come into play again.
Yes, adolescents are actively constructing their identity, forming those desired ideal selves, undreaded, feared self, future versions of who they might become. Moral identity formation from this perspective involves constructing these possible selves, but importantly, loading them with moral meaning. The ideal self becomes someone who is kind, brave, just, and impactful. The feared self might be someone selfish, cowardly, or unfair.
And educators can tap into this.
Absolutely. You can harness that aspirational energy. Ask students to envision their ideal self responding to a difficult conflict situation, or how their dreaded self might respond. Then facilitate a discussion about the stark differences, the choices involved, the feelings associated with each path. This process can be a profound motivator for them to actively choose actions that move them closer to their moral ideal and away from their feared self. It makes moral development an active, self-driven pursuit of who they genuinely want to become. You're helping them navigate towards their internal lighthouse, their best future self.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, from the various rich ways of thinking about moral identity to how it powerfully motivates action and how it develops through childhood and adolescence. But like any complex and evolving area of study, there's always room for skepticism and the road ahead. Some theorists, like those from the social domain theory perspective, have expressed some reservations, haven't they?
Yes, that's true. It's important to acknowledge those critiques. Social domain theorists, broadly speaking, sometimes push back, asking, are we perhaps overcomplicating things by adding another personality variable like moral identity? They argue that those discrepancies we see between moral judgment and moral action aren't necessarily a gap that needs bridging by some internal identity construct.
So what's their explanation?
Instead, they propose that people frequently make multiple types of judgments in any given situation. There are moral judgments about harm, fairness, rights, but also conventional judgments about social norms, rules, etiquette, prudential judgments about safety, comfort, well-being, and personal judgments about individual preferences.
So it's about weighing these different factors.
No, exactly. From their view, it's the coordination and weighing of these different types of judgments that truly matters in determining action, not necessarily some overarching internal moral identity. They might suggest that what looks like a judgment-action gap isn't a gap at all, but just a natural, often rational process of prioritizing, say, a conventional or prudential concern over a moral one in a specific context. They're generally wary of adding too many personality variables to explain behavior.
But moral identity scholars have a compelling counterargument to that, don't they?
They do. They generally argue that while social domain theory is excellent at categorizing the different types of judgments people make, It doesn't fully account for the significant individual differences we observe in how people prioritize moral judgments over others when those judgments conflict.
Ah, the prioritization piece.
Yes. Moral identity helps explain why some individuals consistently prioritize moral congruence, acting in line with their moral judgments even when it conflicts with social conventions, personal desires, or prudential concerns, and even when it's difficult or costly. It helps explain the individual differences in that prioritization process. It tackles the why behind who prioritizes morality.
Okay. So, despite this important and healthy skepticism, why is moral identity still considered so crucial in such a rapidly growing area in moral psychology? What's its enduring value?
Well, there are several key reasons. First, and very significantly, it offers an incredibly efficient and powerful way to integrate the vast and often separate literatures of moral psychology on one side and identity development on the other. It brings these two huge fields together under one coherent theoretical umbrella.
It's huge.
It is. Second, it clearly demonstrates how the self-concept, who we believe ourselves to be, what's important to our sense of self, profoundly motivates social outcomes. It puts the self and its motivational power right at the center of moral functioning, moving beyond just cold cognition.
Okay, what else?
Third, a moral identity framework can genuinely integrate and broaden much of the existing work on moral development, which historically often focused quite narrowly on single moral dimensions, like just moral reasoning or just empathy or just behavior. Moral identity offers a more holistic, integrated view of the moral person. Fourth, it explicitly brings motivational processes right to the forefront of moral psychology. Understanding why people are motivated to be moral, especially over the long haul, is absolutely critical for understanding deep, enduring moral commitment, not just momentary good deeds.
And the fifth point, this seems like the big payoff for our listener, the future educator.
Absolutely. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for practice, moral identity holds incredibly promising innovations for moral education, especially for tackling that persistent judgment-action gap we started with. Understanding moral identity can fundamentally change how we approach character education in schools.
Oh,
It shifts the focus. It's not just about teaching right and wrong as abstract concepts or external rules to be followed. It's about helping young people truly, intrinsically become moral individuals. It's about shaping their internal operating system, helping morality become a core part of who they are.
so it moves from compliance to commitment.
Precisely. It shifts the paradigm from seeking external compliance to fostering deeply rooted internal commitment. It's about nurturing what we might call genuine moral authorship in children, helping them write their own moral story.
Of course, like any evolving and robust field, there are still important future directions and significant gaps in our knowledge. What are some key areas needing more research?
Oh, definitely. For instance, we desperately need more robust and diverse measurement techniques for moral identity. We need to move beyond relying so heavily on self-report surveys or simple behavioral proxies like counting community service hours. We need more nuanced ways to capture its internal complexity, maybe using implicit measures more, or sophisticated narrative analysis, or even neuroimaging.
And better study designs.
Yes, critically, more sophisticated study designs are needed. We need more longitudinal studies that track individuals over many years to truly understand the developmental trajectories and stability of moral identity. And we need more clever experimental designs to better understand cause and effect relationships and isolate the specific mechanisms linking moral identity to action in different contexts.
What specific knowledge gaps still exist?
There's still relatively scant knowledge on several crucial areas. For example, cultural differences. How is moral identity understood and expressed differently in more collectivist versus individualistic societies? What are its neurological bases, which brain regions and networks are involved in representing and activating the moral self? How stable is moral identity across diverse situations and over long stretches of time? What are the precise developmental processes at a micro level, especially in early childhood? What are the exact mechanisms linking moral identity to action? Is it primarily self-consistency, schema accessibility, emotional regulation, or some combination? And how do moral cognitions and moral emotions interact within a moral identity framework?
Lots to explore still.
Absolutely. And perhaps most importantly, more dedicated work is needed to really compare, contrast, and truly integrate the various theoretical approaches we discussed today, the character views, the social cognitive views, the relational views. Pushing towards a more unified, comprehensive understanding is a major goal for the future. It's a rich, dynamic field with so much more to uncover, promising profound insights into what truly makes us good.
So we've taken a really deep dive into moral identity today. We've seen it's fundamentally about morality being central to a person's sense of self. We explored it through diverse perspectives, from those trait-like character views emphasizing stable essences to the dynamic social cognitive approaches highlighting mental processes and situational influences. We've discussed the compelling evidence linking moral identity to consistent moral action, demonstrating its real power as an internal motivator. And we gained some fascinating insights into how this profound moral compass develops from those crucial early childhood foundations right through the complex ideological shifts of adolescence.
And if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, especially for educators like you listening today, understanding moral identity really means shifting perspective. It's moving away from simply teaching rules and expecting compliance, towards intentionally cultivating a deeper internal commitment to what is good and right within each child's developing sense of self.
Building the inner compass, not just handing out a map.
That's a perfect way to put it. Building a robust inner compass that guides them intrinsically, not just providing a map for others to tell them where to go.
So here's where it gets really interesting, perhaps, for your own professional journey. As you continue your studies in elementary education, as you start to envision your future classroom, how might you intentionally design learning environments, daily interactions, curriculum choices that don't just teach moral lessons, but actively help students build and integrate morality into their very sense of who they are? How can you foster that enduring moral commitment from the inside out, empowering them to become deeply moral individuals who lead with integrity, who act with compassion, even, maybe especially, when no one is watching?
That really raises the ultimate question for practice, doesn't it? What concrete, meaningful opportunities can we create for children and young adults, starting from the earliest years, to not just understand moral principles intellectually, but to truly experience them, to feel them as a core, joyful, and self-defining part of their own identity, driving their choices with profound certainty and a genuine desire to make a positive difference in the world?
It's about nurturing the moral self.
One authentic action, one supportive relationship, one reflective moment at a time.
Yeah.